How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so when we look back through the history of philosophy, what we find are some very striking examples of thinkers whose works were ignored or even ridiculed while they were alive, only to become dominant in intellectual life after their death. And I'd say that among the most prominent examples here are Soren Kierkegaard and Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, of course, today they're widely regarded as philosophical pioneers or even geniuses, yet during their lifetimes, they clearly struggled in trying to get an audience or really any recognition or respect whatsoever. So let's consider Kierkegaard first. Born in 1813 and who lived a short life, and I'll get to that a bit later. So Kierkegaard published prolifically, most often on the topics of the meaning of faith and human existence. Yet his work, his books, they weren't really read outside of Copenhagen. And to the extent that some had read him, he was often just mocked rather than respected. One particular hostile situation is well known. So in 1845, Kierkegaard criticized the satirical newspaper, The Corsair, for its sensationalism and for its gossipy nature. Well, that didn't go well because the editors of that paper responded by publishing a series mocking Kierkegaard and even grossly caricaturing him. They made him out to be this ridiculous, foppish figure who didn't deserve to be taken seriously. Now, because of this, and because Copenhagen at this time was a pretty small city, Kierkegaard became a target of public mockery. A public mockery on the streets. People laughed at him as he walked by, and they even imitated him. He later said of this situation that he had almost been tormented to death by laughter. But this wasn't his only problem. Another major issue was that what he wrote about was not only ahead of its time, but it was also pretty much in direct conflict with the current philosophical climate. You see, what was popular at this time was the German philosopher Hegel's philosophical outlook, which could be characterized as abstract and as rational and as system building. Well, what Kierkegaard mostly wrote about was not large philosophical systems, but the interpersonal life of the individual. He wrote about subjectivity, emphasizing what it means to live as an individual and to experience struggle and what he called the leap of faith. All things which couldn't be reduced to rational explanation. Needless to say, given this climate at that time, what Kierkegaard was saying just didn't fit, and so it didn't resonate with his contemporaries. Now, Kierkegaard died at the age of just 42. He just collapsed in the street and never recovered. Now, no one seems to know for sure why he died. But factors like social ostracization combined with a sensitive psychology and a fragile constitution certainly could have played a factor. Anyway, what was certain is that Kierkegaard died with little international reputation. It was only in the early 20th century that his work began to resonate with other philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger. What they found in him was a hugely important precursor to their own existential concerns. And from that point on, Kierkegaard was on the map big time. Actually, so much so that he's now often referred to as the father of existentialism. In one of his journals, Kierkegaard said this. He said, "My work will not be finished until after my death." Well, he was right. Okay, so the second philosopher I mentioned was the German Arthur Schopenhauer, who was born in 1788. And he's another example of someone who wrote important philosophical works but was pretty much completely ignored during his lifetime. Now, part of the reason for this was that he too published and lectured when German philosophy was dominated by Hegel, whose massive prestige at the time left little room for philosophical rivals. Actually, Schopenhauer hated Hegel because he thought he was a philosophical fraud. And so what he did is he scheduled his lectures at Berlin at the same time as Hegel's to try to one-up him. But of course, things didn't quite go the way he planned. All the students, well, they flocked to Hegel's lectures, while Schopenhauer's classroom would almost always be empty. But it wasn't just this that accounted for his lack of attention. It was also the kind of worldview that he formulated in his works. I mean, his philosophical outlook, it's an extremely dark vision of things. A view where the fundamental reality is a blind, endlessly striving will that condemns us all to infinite suffering. Yeah, not that inspiring. And you could see how it would be considered unappealing compared to the more optimistic views of his contemporaries. The bottom line is that for many decades, Schopenhauer's work sold poorly, and he didn't attract much of a reputation. Actually, essentially, he spent much of his life in obscurity, where he would continue to write papers, but always harboring a vindictiveness against an academic world that ignored him. As sad as it is, for most of his working life, his only real companions were his poodles. But a lot like what happened with Kierkegaard, in the second half of the 19th century, Schopenhauer experienced a rebirth, an incredible rebirth. And it was actually his dark pessimism that caught on and found resonance. Whether it was writers like Tolstoy or Thomas Mann, or musicians like Richard Wagner, or psychologists like Freud, or philosophers like Nietzsche. These people, they all found inspiration in his pessimistic philosophy, one that also postulated an unconscious mind and all of the irrationalities that go along with that. In this way, he became a hugely important influence in the disciplines of literature and psychology and philosophy. Okay, so the last philosopher I have in mind is the German Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844, and who also didn't live long, and I'll get to that in a moment. So Nietzsche did sell a few books in his life, but still, we're talking about numbers in the low hundreds here. And by and large, he was pretty much invisible in terms of public perception. Now why? Why was he so ignored? Well, one reason, and this applies certainly in his earlier academic life, one reason was because of his unconventional writing style. He just didn't conform to accepted standards. He wrote poetically and unsystematically and aphoristically, and he didn't write with many footnotes. And in doing all this, he alienated himself from other academics who probably took him more as a literary stylist rather than a substantial thinker. But a more important reason for his non-acceptance probably had something to do with his absolutely scathing attack on things like morality and truth, and most of all, of course, Christianity. You know, the whole God is dead thing. You could understand why this might seem dangerous and even blasphemous in a time when Christian values and virtues still dominated Europe. But actually, maybe the factor that played the greatest role in Nietzsche's alienation from society and so failure in being recognized were his severe health problems, like his migraines and his failing eyesight and so on. They probably played a role in his eventual secluded lifestyle, one where he spent the last 10 years of his active life wandering around completely alone in the mountains and in the resorts in Switzerland and Italy. In 1889, Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse and never recovered, which scholars speculate could have been due to syphilis, something he may have contracted earlier in his life. He was only 56 when he eventually died. Well, like with Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's fame grew posthumously, and it grew enormously. By the early 20th century, Nietzsche had become a huge influence on existentialist philosophers and on psychoanalysts and even on artists, especially on the avant-garde variety. His concept of the overman and his pronouncement on the death of God, once ignored or feared, now became foremost in debates about modernity. So again, like the other two philosophers I mentioned, those things that were often dismissed as silly or extreme in Nietzsche's own time later proved to be right on the mark. They proved to be absolutely prophetical in diagnosing the uncertainty of a non-religious and disenchanted age. In one of his last books, Nietzsche tells us this. He writes, "I know my fate. One day, my name will be associated with something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth." Well, he was right. So what are we to take from all of this? Well, it's that even if someone is misunderstood or marginalized during their lifetime, it doesn't mean that there's nothing there. In the case of these philosophers, the three of them, each of them became absolutely foundational to later thought, even though hardly anyone knew their names while they were alive. This suggests, I think, that sometimes personal obscurity or alienation is not of our own doing, but rather it's rooted in a conflict or incongruity between what we believe and want so badly to express and what the dominant climate is of our time. Sometimes our audience isn't ready to hear what needs to be said. Or, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra puts it, "I am not the mouth for these ears." Bye for now.